It often begins quietly, not with alarms or declarations, but with a moment so ordinary it barely registers at first. A man in a cockpit glances at the horizon. A scientist stares at a number that refuses to behave. A nurse pauses in a corridor that seems no different from any other. These are not moments that announce themselves as history. They arrive like a whisper and only later reveal their weight. This story is not about secrets in the dramatic sense. It is about people who believed they were doing their jobs honestly, carefully, and with integrity. People who encountered something unexpected and chose to speak about it, not because they sought attention, but because truth felt like an obligation. What followed was not applause or debate, but silence, carefully constructed, professionally enforced, and deeply human in its consequences. Across decades and disciplines, similar patterns repeat. A discovery challenges an assumption. An observation refuses to fit the accepted frame. At first, there is curiosity, even encouragement. Then the atmosphere changes. Meetings are canceled. Doors close. Files disappear. What was once a career becomes a question mark, and then a warning to others. This is not a story about whether every claim was correct. History rarely offers such clarity. It is about what happens when institutions built to preserve knowledge also learn how to protect themselves. About the fragile space where curiosity meets authority, and how easily that space can collapse. We tend to imagine truth as something solid, waiting patiently to be uncovered. But truth lives inside systems, universities, governments, laboratories, media organizations, and systems have memories of their own. They remember what threatens stability. They remember what disrupts funding, reputation, or consensus. Sometimes they respond not by debating ideas, but by removing the people who carry them. The individuals at the center of this narrative were not radicals or provocateurs. Many were respected professionals, cautious by training, conservative in method. Pilots trained to trust instruments. Researchers trained to doubt themselves before doubting data. Journalists trained to verify every claim. Teachers trained to encourage questions within boundaries. None set out to challenge the foundations of reality. They simply followed evidence where it led. What makes their experiences unsettling is not the phenomena they described, but the reaction they encountered. Careers unraveled with alarming speed. Medical records changed. Access was revoked. Colleagues fell silent. In some cases, entire professional histories were rewritten as if they had never existed. The message was rarely spoken aloud, but it was unmistakable. Some questions come at too high a cost. For the rest of us, these stories pose a quieter challenge. We live in a culture that celebrates innovation and courage. In retrospect, long after the risks have passed. But in real time, uncertainty is uncomfortable. It asks institutions to admit they might be incomplete or wrong. It asks us, as a society, to tolerate ambiguity without immediately resolving it. This series is an invitation to sit with that discomfort, to listen carefully to accounts that were marginalized, not to accept them blindly, but to understand what it means when the response to curiosity is erasure rather than conversation. To consider how knowledge advances, not just through breakthroughs, but through the courage to remain visible when invisibility is safer. As we move through these chapters, each story will unfold slowly, grounded in human experience rather than spectacle. The question guiding us is simple, but not easy. When people say they saw something they cannot explain, what does it cost them to say so? And what does it cost us when they are silenced? The answers are not neat. They never are. But they are worth listening to, if only to remind ourselves that progress is not just a matter of discovery, but of how we choose to respond when discovery unsettles what we thought we knew. It started with a clear sky and routine coordinates, nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Commander David Fravor, a decorated Navy pilot, had flown these waters off San Diego many times before. On November 14, 2004, the horizon looked as it always did. And then, in the space between clouds and calm, the impossible appeared. A white, oblong object hovered above the ocean like a ghost freed from gravity. No wings, no engines, just 40 feet of silent defiance. Fravor's instincts kicked in. He and his wingman descended to intercept, their FA-18 Super Hornets engineered for speed, power, precision. But what they faced ignored all those rules. It moved without acceleration, without inertia. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. It danced through the sky as if physics were a suggestion, not a law. It wasn't just Fravor who saw it. His wingman, Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate, reported the same impossible maneuvers. Video from their weapons systems officer, Chad Underwood, would later capture part of the encounter. Infrared footage, radar blips, movements faster than any known aircraft. The object could stop in midair, turn at right angles at hypersonic speeds, maneuvers that would crush any human body, tear apart any machine designed by our species. When they returned to base, the mood was tense but professional. Fravor filed his report. Debriefings were held. Equipment was collected. At first, it seemed the system was working as it should, observations analyzed, data gathered. But within 2 days, everything changed. Orders arrived. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. Records were sealed. Fravor was transferred. It wasn't a conversation, it was a command. Forget what you saw. And when he didn't forget, the erosion began. His mental health was quietly questioned. Former allies were advised to keep their distance. His security clearance, essential for any high-level military pilot, was revoked. Fravor had not broken protocol. He had not spoken recklessly. He had simply seen something he could not explain and had reported it. But the silence that followed was not the passive kind. It was an active unmaking. Data vanished. Radar logs were lost. Infrared recordings confiscated by people who provided no names and no ranks. His squadron's official logs were scrubbed clean. Years later, when Fravor chose to speak publicly, fragments of validation surfaced. Pentagon videos were quietly declassified. Other pilots confirmed similar sightings. And yet the damage had been done. The message was clear to anyone watching. See something unexplainable, and your career becomes expendable. Why would a system built on discipline, technology, and intelligence go to such lengths to bury a story rather than study it? That is the real mystery. Not the craft itself, but the fear it exposed. The fear that some knowledge can't be controlled, can't be explained, can't be placed neatly on a chart or in a file. Fravor's story isn't just about unidentified aerial phenomena. It's about what happens when a disciplined truth-teller becomes inconvenient, when honesty becomes a liability, not a virtue, and when reality, however fleeting, refuses to conform to what we're told it must be. We often assume suppression happens only to the unstable or the fringe, but what if it also happens to the most credible among us? Pilots trained to observe, to document, to survive in high-stakes environments. If their voices can be discredited with a single form, a quiet transfer, a hint of instability in a medical file, what does that say about the fragility of truth within powerful systems? What Fravor saw may remain unexplained, but the silence that followed was perfectly engineered. And perhaps that silence tells us more than the encounter ever could. The Earth does not lie. Or so Dr. Virginia Steen-McIntyre believed when she crouched beside the excavated strata of the Hueyatlaco site in Mexico, brushing away dust from tools far older than they should have been. The year was 1973, and she was a respected geologist, young, meticulous, trained to trust data over dogma. Her findings were startling. Using uranium series dating, fission track analysis, and other advanced methods, Steen-McIntyre calculated the age of the artifacts at approximately 250,000 years, stone tools shaped by human hands, buried deep within layers of volcanic ash. The implication was clear. Humans had lived in the Americas far earlier than the accepted timeline allowed. Not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years earlier. She wasn't working alone. Other scientists confirmed the results. Multiple dating techniques all converged on the same impossible conclusion. But what should have been a groundbreaking discovery instead became a professional death sentence. When she submitted her paper to the journal Quaternary Research, it was initially accepted. Then, without warning, it was rejected. The editors claimed her methods were flawed, without explanation, without counter-data. Soon the silence closed in. Her research funding dried up. Her access to labs was revoked. Invitations to conferences vanished. Colleagues began to avoid her, not out of disagreement, but out of fear. Careers in science depend not just on discovery, but on alignment with consensus. And she had wandered too far outside the lines. It didn't stop there. Anonymous critiques appeared in professional publications questioning her competence, implying she misunderstood the very techniques she had mastered. These weren't genuine debates. They were surgical strikes against her credibility. Universities declined to host her lectures. Journals refused to publish her follow-ups, no matter how rigorous. Other geologists quietly admitted they had seen similar anomalies, but they offered no support. Some were junior and feared for their careers. Others had families to support. The stakes were too high. And so Dr. Steen-McIntyre was left in exile. Her career as a geologist in ruins. The field she had devoted her life to now treated her as a cautionary tale. Not because she was wrong, but because she had dared to suggest that the timeline of human history might need rewriting. Decades passed. New discoveries emerged. Improved dating methods began to confirm that human presence in the Americas extended back far beyond the Clovis culture. The academic tide shifted. What once was considered heresy became viable theory. But by then, the damage was done. No apology came. No recognition. Only a quiet, retrospective acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been right all along. This is not the story of a mistake. It is the story of a boundary, one drawn not in soil or stone, but in fear. Fear that an outlier data point, if allowed to stand, could unravel decades of certainty. Fear that to acknowledge one anomaly might invite others. Better then to silence the anomaly and the person who brought it forward. Dr. Steen-McIntyre's experience reminds us that science is not immune to human impulses, that data alone is not always enough, that truth can be delayed, not by ignorance, but by institutional caution dressed as consensus. And so we're left with a quiet question. What other truths lie buried, not beneath ash and sediment, but beneath fear? Who else has unearthed something the world was not ready to see? And what did it cost them to tell us? She arrived for her shift like any other night. The corridors of Walter Reed Army Medical Center glowed with the soft hum of fluorescent light, the steady rhythm of a place designed to hold order against the chaos of human frailty. Maria Gonzalez, a registered nurse with 3 years of impeccable service, was about to step beyond the edge of what she believed reality could contain. That night in 1980, she was assigned to a section of the hospital she had never entered before, a restricted wing requiring enhanced clearance and additional confidentiality agreements. There was no explanation, just signatures and silence. Inside, she found something that would fracture her sense of the possible forever. 3 bodies lay on examination tables, small, fragile-looking forms with enlarged craniums and dark, expressionless eyes. They weren't mannequins. They weren't human. Their anatomy followed a different logic altogether: organs, tissues, cellular structures that defied classification. The procedures, performed by seasoned medical professionals, followed standard autopsy protocols. But the findings were anything but standard. Maria wasn't supposed to ask questions. But she was a nurse, not a soldier. Her instinct was to understand, to care, to speak. She recorded everything she saw, in notes, in memory. She believed she had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would change everything we knew about life, biology, and our place in the universe. But as quickly as the experience arrived, it began to vanish. Her colleagues denied knowledge of the events. The restricted wing, she was told, didn't exist. When she pressed for answers, her clearance was revoked. Her schedule changed. Her access to records was blocked. It was as if the hospital itself began to forget she had ever been involved. Then came the accusations, alleged medication errors, disciplinary actions that had never occurred. Her nursing license was suspended. Her professional file had been altered. Documents vanished. Conversations were reframed. Even her pay records for the classified assignment were erased. When she reached out for legal help, she found nothing. No proof of her assignment, no trace of her work in the restricted wing. It was more than discrediting. It was erasure. And then came the most disturbing part, the campaign to convince her she had imagined it all. Military psychiatrists subjected her to involuntary evaluations. She was administered medications without her consent. Her family was told she was delusional, stressed, unstable. The goal was not merely to discredit, but to disorient, to separate her from the very foundation of her own memory. Years later, others would speak of similar experiences: medical staff, contractors, whistleblowers. Their stories shared eerie similarities: anatomy that didn't belong, silence that followed, lives quietly unmade. Maria Gonzalez never returned to nursing. The profession that once gave her identity and purpose became the site of her undoing. Her health suffered. Her name became a caution, not a credential, but she never recanted. Her story asks a question not about aliens, but about systems, about what a society does when someone sees something outside the frame, about how power defends itself not just with secrecy, but with unmaking, erasure, gaslighting, the slow, methodical severing of a person from their own experience. If we define sanity by what the world agrees is possible, what happens when the world pretends it didn't see? Maria's silence was not voluntary. It was engineered. Her story remains not because it was amplified, but because it survived every attempt to disappear it, and perhaps that is the most important testimony of all. He was an engineer, a builder of systems, a mind trained to solve problems within the hard rules of physics. Robert Scott didn't believe in myths or speculation. His work was grounded in numbers, schematics, and material tolerances. That's why, when he was invited in 1987 to join a classified reverse engineering project, he approached it not with awe, but with focus. What he found, however, broke the rules of everything he had ever studied. The technology he was asked to examine didn't belong to any known human development. It used superconductors that worked at room temperature, energy systems with no visible input or decay, and propulsion devices that appeared to manipulate gravity itself. No combustion, no emissions, no conventional thrust, just movement. Clean, silent, and impossible. He was told very little, just that the hardware had been recovered and that his task was to analyze it. He documented everything, every circuit, every material, every theoretical anomaly. His reports were meticulous, supported by models and reproducible tests. The implications were staggering. Near infinite energy, instantaneous motion, scientific principles that could dismantle everything we thought we understood about energy and motion. When the project ended, Scott saw potential for humanity. If these principles could be applied to civilian life, they could end our energy crisis, reshape transportation, even redefine physics itself. So he reached out to research institutions, energy companies, aerospace firms, not with secrets, but with ideas, concepts, blueprints for a better world. That's when the ground began to shift beneath him. His security clearance vanished. His resume was altered. Work history redacted. Names of former colleagues no longer returned. Government contractors were instructed never to hire him. Then came the attacks, accusations of ethics violations, alleged security breaches. Whisper campaigns that labeled him unreliable, unstable. But worse than professional destruction was what followed: erasure. University alumni records scrubbed his name. His published papers disappeared from engineering databases. His patents were flagged and blocked under the vague claim of national security risk. His personal documents were seized during unannounced visits. Even his educational credentials were questioned, his professional certifications suspended without hearing. When he tried to file a patent for a theoretical design based on the principles he had studied, the application was rejected, not for scientific reasons, but because the concept was classified. Yet it was his concept, his research, his mind. He became, in effect, a non-person. And then, quietly, years later, the world began to catch up. Technologies emerged in elite defense and aerospace circles, devices with principles eerily similar to what Scott had once worked on. But there was no trace of him, no citation, no recognition. His fingerprints had been wiped clean. Scott's story is not about a lone inventor seeking glory. It is about what happens when a man tries to bring light to a room that others want to keep dark. When progress is not denied but delayed, hidden behind a curtain of silence until it can be controlled. His experience asks us to consider a chilling idea, that some technologies are not lost but buried. Not because they don't work, but because they work too well, because they empower too many, and because power, when threatened, will always choose secrecy over revolution. What does it mean to erase a person? Not just from institutions, but from memory, from the archive of human achievement. Robert Scott may never recover what was taken from him, but his silence, forced, strategic, total, speaks louder than any invention could. Sometimes the clearest proof of what was found is how hard the world works to pretend it never existed at all. History, we like to believe, is fixed. A record of what was, carved in the stone of scholarship and preserved in archives. But what happens when the past itself is edited, quietly, strategically, and with intent? Dr. Eleanor Watson thought she understood history. As a World War II specialist, she had spent years in dusty archives comparing primary documents, verifying timelines, tracing decisions that shaped nations. But as she delved deeper into military communications and diplomatic correspondence, inconsistencies began to emerge. Numbers didn't match. Events had been shifted. Civilian casualties disappeared from one draft to the next. Entire negotiations, once documented, were nowhere to be found. At first, she assumed error, misfiling, bureaucratic clumsiness. But as the pattern grew, so did the realization. This was no accident. Key documents had been altered, physically edited, with entire sections redacted, rewritten, or removed. The falsifications weren't sloppy. They were precise, aimed at reshaping the narrative of war and its aftermath. Political alliances were recast as moral certainties. Strategic failures became victories. Civilian suffering was airbrushed into footnotes. Watson began cross-referencing original documents with official histories and discovered that the published version of World War II diverged from what had actually happened. The truth, it seemed, had been curated for a specific purpose: to support a post-war narrative that aligned with power. She documented everything: photographs of marginal notes, comparisons of original and altered versions, verified through authentication techniques. She followed protocol, submitting papers to respected journals. At first, there was interest. Peer reviewers called her work meticulous, provocative, essential. Then the silence came. Papers were withdrawn. Editors reversed decisions. Invitations to speak were rescinded. Her professional memberships were revoked without explanation. Former colleagues stopped returning calls. Universities that once praised her research began locking her out of archives. Materials she had previously accessed were suddenly missing, under restoration, or reclassified. She filed requests, lodged appeals. The answers came back cold and bureaucratic. Access denied, materials restricted, status confidential. Anonymous critiques appeared in historical publications, subtle but effective. They questioned her methods, implied bias, and hinted at instability. Not refutations, but erasures of credibility. Her attempts to form independent research groups failed when funding quietly disappeared. Even private donors backed out after receiving anonymous calls. And then she discovered the most disturbing layer. She wasn't the first. Other historians, too, had stumbled upon similar inconsistencies. Each had faced a comparable fate: public discrediting, professional exile, vanishing access. They had been scattered, isolated, and silenced. Dr. Watson's experience reveals a truth that many find uncomfortable: that history is not always written by the victors, but by those with the power to redact. That the past can be shaped not just through omission, but through institutional force, and that the guardians of our collective memory can also be its editors. What does it mean when a civilization edits its own story, when facts become fluid and memory becomes a battleground? We often think of censorship as a blade drawn in the open, but more often it is quiet: a revoked pass, a rejected paper, a lost file. And once the record is rewritten, what remains of the original is only what a few still remember. Dr. Watson remembered, and for that she was removed, not by violence, but by erasure. History, it seems, is not only about what we preserve, it is also about what we allow to vanish. It began, as so many scientific breakthroughs do, with a signal, just a faint pulse from the cosmos, barely more than noise. But to Dr. Sarah Chen, a NASA astronomer stationed at the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex, it was a whisper from the void that didn't behave like anything natural. She was monitoring standard radio emissions from the Vega star system when something unusual caught her eye: a pattern, then repetition, prime numbers, sequences too precise to be random. The signal wasn't noise, it was structured, intelligent. At first, she doubted herself. She ran the data through multiple systems. Each time, the same result. The signal exhibited characteristics of artificial design: compression algorithms, error correction codes, mathematical constants encoded with precision. These were hallmarks of deliberate transmission, not the chaotic hum of stellar radiation. She followed protocol, documented everything, submitted her findings through internal channels. Her initial reports were met with enthusiasm, verification studies were ordered, the instruments were recalibrated. Independent analysts confirmed it: the signal was real, and unlike anything Earth had sent or received. Then came the shift. Within days, Chen was ordered to cease her investigation. Her access to radio telescope data was revoked. Her security clearance suspended. Files disappeared. When she pushed back, trying to preserve her research, her computer systems were disabled. The signals were suddenly classified, off limits to civilian scientists, even to those who had initially assisted her analysis. She tried to raise the alarm through the scientific community, but found doors quietly closing. Publications declined her submissions, citing lack of verification. Conferences rescinded her invitations. Colleagues, once supportive, now avoided contact. Then came the smear. Internal reviews accused her of misinterpreting natural phenomena. Claims circulated that she had fabricated data, that she had overstepped her scope. Whispers of instability followed. Her reputation, carefully built over years of disciplined work, began to crumble. Other astronomers tried to help, briefly, but they were warned off. Some were denied access to similar data, others were reassigned. The implications were chilling. It wasn't just her discovery that had been buried. The very possibility of extraterrestrial contact had become untouchable. Years later, when she submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to recover her records, the response was blunt. No such files existed. Her work had been erased, as if the signals and her role in decoding them had never happened. And yet she remembered, not just the signal, but the moment of awe, the idea that something, someone, might be reaching across the stars, not with conquest or fear, but with mathematics, the one language we might share. That for a moment the universe opened a door. Dr. Chen's story is not just about the suppression of a potential first contact. It's about the fear of paradigm shifts. What happens when discovery threatens not only science, but belief systems, governance, control? When the truth, if known, would force humanity to see itself differently? The silence around her discovery didn't come from a lack of evidence. It came from the weight of what that evidence implied. Somewhere, beyond the reach of telescopes now turned away, the signal may still pulse, waiting, unanswered, and in that silence we are left to wonder, what else have we refused to hear? It was supposed to be just another day in the desert. The light was perfect, the shadows long and sharp, ideal conditions for landscape photography. Marcus Rodriguez, a professional photographer known for capturing stark beauty in remote places, had no idea his camera would record something that would unravel his life. Near the edges of the Nevada desert, not far from the perimeter of the infamous Area 51 facility, Rodriguez noticed something in the sky. At first, it seemed like a glint, a speck. But through his telephoto lens, it became undeniable. Disc-shaped objects hovered motionless at impossible altitudes. Then, without a sound, they moved. He captured it all: abrupt accelerations, gravity-defying turns, hovering maneuvers with no wings, no engines, no exhaust. His high-resolution equipment recorded clear imagery, complete with embedded metadata, GPS coordinates, timestamps, lens specifications. Everything authenticated. Nothing could be dismissed as fake. Back home, reviewing the photographs, he felt an uneasy thrill. These weren't just anomalies, they were evidence, the kind that could ignite debate across science, defense, and the public sphere. So he reached out: newspapers, magazines, aerospace experts. He sent samples to media contacts. And then the silence descended. Not long after, federal agents arrived. No warning, no warrant. His home was searched. Equipment was confiscated: cameras, hard drives, backups. He was arrested under charges related to photographing a classified facility. Interrogated, pressured, told he had broken national security laws. They didn't just want the images. They wanted him to believe he hadn't seen what he saw. Psychologists suggested he had misinterpreted weather balloons or experimental aircraft. Officials told him his memories were likely distorted by heat, distance, and imagination. When he pushed back, his photography business suddenly collapsed. Longtime clients pulled out. Exhibitions were canceled. Word spread that he was unwell, paranoid, unreliable. But worse than the personal fallout was what happened to the images. Not just the originals. They were gone, seized, but also the backups, the prints, even the online galleries. His entire portfolio was systematically scrubbed. Years of professional work vanished. When he tried to return to the desert, military patrols now blocked access to areas that had once been open. He was warned further attempts to photograph near restricted zones would lead to permanent legal consequences. His name, once respected in artistic circles, became a ghost. Online mentions were removed, his credentials questioned. He wasn't discredited, he was deleted. Rodriguez had no interest in conspiracy. He wasn't an activist. He had simply documented what his camera saw. But what he witnessed threatened a line that had been carefully drawn between what is seen and what is allowed to be seen. What do we do with evidence that refuses to conform? In Marcus Rodriguez's case, the answer was clear. Bury the proof, discredit the witness, control the narrative. Not through force alone, but through disappearance, not just of images, but of identity. Photography is supposed to be truth, a captured moment, an unalterable record. But when truth itself becomes the threat, the camera becomes a weapon, and those who wield it become targets. Rodriguez's photographs may never resurface, but the question they posed still hangs in the air, like those silent crafts. What did he see? And why was the world so desperate to make sure no one else did? The emergency room is a place where time bends, seconds stretch, hours vanish, lives flicker between hands and heart monitors. Dr. James Patterson had long learned to navigate this chaos. He trusted in medicine, in protocols, in the human body's limits, until he began seeing recoveries that defied them. It started with a patient who should not have survived. A crushed spine, organs ruptured, prognosis fatal. But the man walked out weeks later. No surgery, no explanation. Then more others. Trauma cases healing with impossible speed, severed nerves regenerating, damaged tissue repairing itself in days instead of months. Patterson did not believe in miracles. He believed in data. He documented the cases meticulously. Imaging scans, blood work, daily progress notes. Each chart told the same story. Recoveries that exceeded anything medical literature had ever recorded. He cross-referenced with specialists, consulted neurologists, cellular biologists. The consensus? These outcomes should not exist, and yet they did. Curious and cautious, Patterson submitted a study for peer review detailing the anomalies. He proposed further research, not claiming certainty, but inviting investigation. What if the human body held regenerative capacities we had barely begun to understand? The backlash came swiftly. Journals rejected his work without review. Hospital administrators suspended his research privileges, citing unverified claims. Allegations of unethical experimentation surfaced, fabricated, he insisted. Suddenly, his hospital access was restricted. Colleagues stopped replying. His medical license was placed under investigation. Then came the erasures. Computer systems updated overnight. Patient files, his detailed case records, were no longer accessible. Charts were reassigned, entries deleted. The people he had treated, whose recoveries he had documented, were transferred. Their identities masked, their locations unknown. When he tried to contact them, he found roadblocks, privacy restrictions, no forwarding information, legal threats. Patterson was left in professional limbo, stripped of his practice, his data, his reputation. Rumors spread. He was unstable, a fraud, a man who had let fantasy contaminate medicine. But those who had seen his files knew otherwise. Quietly, a few physicians reached out, admitting they had seen similar cases, but never documented them, for fear of the very fate Patterson now lived. The silence was systemic. When he pursued legal channels, evidence had vanished. When he applied for research grants, he was blacklisted. When he spoke publicly, he was dismissed as fringe. The question wasn't whether his findings were real. It was that they were inconvenient, threatening the boundaries of accepted biology, medical authority, and pharmaceutical models built on predictable outcomes. What Patterson had glimpsed wasn't supernatural. It was natural, just unexplored, perhaps latent, perhaps rare, but real. And that made it dangerous. His story is a reminder that medicine, for all its science, is also a system, and systems defend themselves, especially when confronted with possibilities that suggest we are more than what we've been taught to believe. If the body can heal beyond its known capacity, what else might be possible? What else lies dormant within us? Dr. Patterson no longer practices. He teaches now, quietly, without titles, but he still remembers the patients, the scans, the questions that were never answered because they were never allowed. His experience lingers not as a miracle, but as a warning. Sometimes what we fear most is not that the limits are too high, but that they were never there at all. In the quiet hum of a high school physics lab, something extraordinary began to unfold. Not in a top-secret facility or a far-flung research station, but in an ordinary classroom, under fluorescent lights, with plastic chairs and curious young minds. Robert Kim was not a fringe thinker. He was a passionate educator with a reputation for excellence. He believed in nurturing critical thought, in showing students how the universe worked, from electromagnetism to quantum theory. But during a series of advanced experiments, something happened that even he couldn't explain. It began with fluctuations in the data. Sensitive instruments began registering anomalies when certain students were present. Random number generators behaving non-randomly. Electronic circuits shifting patterns in response to student focus. At first, Kim assumed technical error, but the patterns were consistent, and more than that, they seemed responsive to emotion and intent. Intrigued, he designed controlled experiments, blind tests, repeated trials. The results held. Specific students could influence electronic systems, not dramatically, but measurably. The changes weren't imaginary. They were recorded, time-stamped, statistically significant. What Kim documented carefully and rigorously was the possibility of psychokinesis, not as fantasy, but as a subtle interaction between consciousness and physical systems. Mind affecting matter, not with magic, but through some latent principle science had yet to define. He submitted his findings to journals, not claiming conclusions, but asking for peer input, collaborative study. The response was swift and final. Rejection, not for flawed methods, but for topic alone. Conferences declined his presentations. Colleagues began to distance themselves. Rumors circulated. He was introducing pseudoscience into public education, experimenting unethically on students. His school district launched an investigation. Parents were told he was engaging in non-sanctioned psychological research. Then came the termination. His contract was revoked. The classroom that once buzzed with curiosity was closed to him. His research materials were seized under the claim of protecting student privacy. Video footage, data logs, experiment notes, all confiscated or destroyed. When he applied for other teaching positions, none responded. Informal channels revealed why. His name had been flagged. Unprofessional conduct, inappropriate curriculum, experimental violations. His career in education was over, but perhaps the most chilling part was what happened to the students. Those who had exhibited unusual abilities were quietly transferred to different schools. Some families moved states. No contact information, no follow-up. As if the children had been absorbed into another system entirely, one that didn't share Kim's interest in open inquiry. Kim's work was never about belief. It was about observation. And what he observed posed a question with profound implications. What if the human mind is not just a receiver of information, but an active participant in the fabric of reality? The reaction he faced revealed a deeper truth, that our institutions of learning are not always designed to accommodate paradigm shifts, especially not when they arise from the minds of children in public school labs. Today, Kim lives quietly, away from classrooms, his research now spoken of in private among those still willing to wonder. But his story reminds us that discovery isn't always celebrated. Sometimes it's smothered before it can grow, not because it's false, but because it's too soon. If thought can shape matter, if intention can bend outcomes, then the line between science and self is thinner than we imagined. And perhaps that's what frightened them most. Not that he was wrong, but that he was right, and that the minds shaping the future were still in high school, quietly learning how to change the world, with nothing but focus, emotion, and the will to try. It was never meant to be a front-page story, just another deep-dive investigation into obscure government budgets and quietly buried research grants. But as Lisa Martinez, an investigative journalist known for her precision and persistence, followed the trail of missing funds, she found herself standing at the threshold of something vast and deeply unsettling. Her discovery began with spreadsheets, payments to shell contractors earmarked for cognitive enhancement studies and consciousness modulation research, buried within defense spending and redirected through innocuous institutions. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests, chased paper trails, interviewed former employees. What emerged was a pattern of classified programs that reached far beyond psychological theory. These weren't just studies. They were experiments. Martinez uncovered documentation showing that U.S. intelligence agencies had been funding research into altering perception of time, expanding remote viewing capabilities, enhancing telepathic communication. Programs that used electromagnetic fields, psychoactive compounds, and neurological conditioning to test, and in some cases manipulate, human consciousness itself. Her sources were careful but credible. Scientists, subjects, even administrators who had grown disillusioned. They shared evidence of successful experiments, trained individuals who could perceive distant locations, predict events with alarming accuracy, communicate thoughts without words. Not fantasy, data-backed, controlled, documented. But the breakthroughs were hidden behind layers of secrecy, protected not just by classification, but by denial. Martinez compiled her findings into a comprehensive exposé. She submitted it to multiple major news outlets. Editors praised the depth of her research, the reliability of her sources. But each time, something happened. The stories were pulled. One by one, the publishers backed away. National security concerns were cited, legal threats implied, sources went dark. Some reported being visited by officials, others vanished from contact altogether. And then the focus turned to her. Media networks canceled her contracts. Articles she had written unrelated to the consciousness research began disappearing from websites. Former colleagues received warnings, some subtle, some explicit, not to associate with her. Editors who once fought for her stories now declined her calls. Platforms she attempted to use for independent publication, blogs, podcasts, even self-hosted sites, were throttled or shut down without explanation. Payment processors froze her accounts. Social media flagged her content as misinformation. The campaign wasn't just to silence her, it was to erase her. But the most chilling part came when she realized that others had tried before. Journalists, researchers, whistleblowers, each had come close to revealing similar stories. Each had been quietly dismantled in nearly identical ways. It wasn't just suppression. It was a template. Why? Because these programs didn't just study the human mind. They had discovered ways to alter it. And that power, once known, could not be uninvented. It was a tool too potent to be left in public hands. A lever that could shift not just perception, but reality itself. Martinez now lives in partial obscurity. She never retracted her work, never stopped believing her sources. But her platform is gone, her reach severed. Her story isn't about psychic phenomena, it's about control. Control over what people believe, what they perceive, what they are allowed to know about themselves. If consciousness can be expanded, it can also be confined, and the machinery for both now exists, not in theory, but in practice. Martinez tried to shine a light into that machinery. What she found wasn't a malfunctioning system, it was a system working exactly as designed. The question is no longer whether these technologies exist. The question is, who decides what we are allowed to remember, to think, to be? In the quiet, fluorescent hum of suburban classrooms, few people expect revolutions. But that's where Robert Kim, a dedicated high school teacher, saw something that changed everything he thought he knew about human potential, and paid dearly for it. Kim wasn't looking for anomalies, he was just trying to teach physics. But during one semester, strange patterns emerged. Students participating in experiments involving electromagnetic fields were producing unexpected results. Sensitive instruments would shift readings in ways that defied environmental explanation. Equipment behaved erratically, but only around certain students. Curious, Kim began isolating variables. He discovered that these anomalies weren't random. They were linked to student emotion, focus, and presence. A few students, under certain conditions, could affect machines with their minds, not in dramatic cinematic bursts, but in consistent, measurable patterns. Statistical anomalies that suggested something real, if not yet understood. He called it psychokinesis, though he knew the word carried weight and risk. So he proceeded carefully, documenting everything: video footage, sensor logs, independent observers. He didn't claim proof. He invited inquiry. A hypothesis, not a headline. Then the silence turned to noise. School administrators launched an inquiry claiming he had conducted unauthorized experiments. He was accused of exposing students to psychological risk. Parents were told he was promoting pseudoscience. His teaching contract was terminated mid-semester. His research materials were confiscated. His school files were scrubbed of commendations, replaced with vague warnings about unorthodox practices. He was blacklisted from school districts across the region. Job applications disappeared into voids. Calls went unreturned. But the most disturbing part wasn't his own professional demise, it was what happened to his students. The few who had demonstrated anomalous abilities were abruptly transferred. Their families relocated. Kim lost all contact. Attempts to reach out were blocked by privacy laws and protective orders. It was as if they'd been absorbed into a system he could no longer see. Kim tried to publish his findings in educational journals, but none would touch the subject. His name, once associated with innovation and excellence, now carried a stigma. Universities declined to affiliate. Grants evaporated. He hadn't broken laws. He had broken boundaries. The implication of his work was simple, yet staggering. Human consciousness might possess latent, scientifically observable influence over physical systems, not fantasy, not faith, but a real, testable bridge between mind and matter. And that, it seemed, was too dangerous to be allowed. The fear wasn't that Kim was wrong. It was that he might be right, and that if he was, the implications would reach into neuroscience, education, social policy, even national security. The idea that consciousness could be trained to interact with the physical world would demand a rethinking of everything from curriculum to control. So the system responded the only way it knew how, not with debate, but with erasure. Kim now lives far from the academic world, teaching quietly, never using the word psychokinesis in public. But he still wonders what became of those students, whether they ever found answers, whether they're still being studied elsewhere in silence. His story is not a tale of superstition. It is a story of suppressed science, of doors opened and slammed shut, of the human mind not as a mystery to be feared, but a frontier to be explored, if only we were allowed. If students can change the outcome of an experiment with thought alone, what else might they change? And what does it say about us that we'd rather silence that question than hear the answer? They came forward with honesty. 10 people from different walks of life: pilots, geologists, nurses, engineers, astronomers, teachers, historians, doctors, photographers, and journalists. None sought fame. None craved controversy. They simply told the truth as they had lived it, expecting the systems they served to listen, to question, to investigate. Instead, they were silenced. Their stories are not isolated anomalies. Each begins with an observation, a moment when the known world cracks open, revealing something strange, wondrous, or unsettling. A craft that violates physics. A tool buried before it should have existed. A signal from the stars. a healing that defies biology, a photograph, a transmission, a pattern, a child with impossible potential. Each of them followed protocol. They filed reports, conducted research, asked questions. And then, one by one, they were dismantled. At first, it's subtle. Questions about their mental health, sudden loss of access, colleagues growing distant. Then come the fabricated allegations, the altered records, the revoked clearances, the forced transfers, the institutional gaslighting. By the end, they are not just discredited. They are erased. We think of suppression as a blunt tool, censorship, violence, threats. But in the modern age, suppression is elegant. It looks like professionalism. It speaks in the language of ethics and procedure. It hides behind bureaucracy, behind security, behind reputation management. It doesn't just destroy the data, it destroys the person attached to it. What binds these 10 together is not just what they saw, it is what was done to them after they saw it. Because if they had simply been mistaken, they could have been corrected. If they had fabricated, they could have been disproven. But instead, they were treated as threats, not to truth, but to control. And that distinction is crucial. Truth in a healthy society is something we pursue even when it is inconvenient. But control is something we maintain by shaping perception, by erasing contradictions. When institutions are built to preserve stability above all else, truth becomes negotiable, and witnesses become liabilities. These 10 individuals bore that cost. Some lost careers, others lost health. A few lost their names. None received justice. Most received only silence. But their stories, even buried, did not disappear. Whistleblowers emerged. Declassified files surfaced. Confirmations trickled in through new technologies, new discoveries, new voices, willing to risk the same fate. And with each small crack, a pattern becomes clearer. We are not being protected from delusion. We are being protected from transformation, because the implications of what these witnesses saw are vast. If human history is older than we think, our story must be rewritten. If gravity can be bent, our technology must evolve. If the mind can shape matter, our understanding of consciousness must expand. And if others are out there, our sense of isolation must end. These are not just questions of science. They are questions of power, of who gets to decide what is real, of who controls the boundaries of the possible. The people in this story stepped across those boundaries, not recklessly, but because their work took them there. And when they tried to speak, they were not met with curiosity. They were met with fear. Perhaps the question now is not whether they were right. Perhaps the question is, why were so many willing to destroy them rather than find out? There is a peculiar silence that follows the truth when it threatens to change everything. Not the silence of ignorance, but of deliberate stillness, of files redacted, voices muted, and questions turned inward. The kind of silence that hums just beneath the surface of institutions meant to seek knowledge, not bury it. Across 14 parts, we've listened to the echoes of that silence. 10 witnesses whose only crime was seeing too much, knowing too deeply, or asking the questions that rattled the foundations of certainty. Pilots who watched the sky twist in ways our laws of motion can't explain. Scientists who dated humanity further back than textbooks allow. Healers who documented recoveries medicine couldn't account for. Photographers, historians, teachers, ordinary people drawn into extraordinary truths. And the pattern holds. It always holds. First comes the anomaly, the strange, the unaccounted for. Then the inquiry, tentative but earnest. Then the clampdown. Reputations eroded, access revoked, evidence vanished. Character dismantled by whisper, by doubt, by erasure. Careers turned into cautionary tales, not because these people were wrong, but because they broke an unspoken rule. They refused to pretend the impossible wasn't real. This is not about whether aliens exist, or whether psychic abilities are real, or whether history has been rewritten. This is about something deeper, our collective relationship with uncertainty, our fear of the disruptive, our instinct to defend the known even when the unknown stands plainly before us. Because to accept one of these stories, even tentatively, is to open the door to all the others. To admit that our understanding of consciousness, time, biology, history, and the universe may be incomplete. That science is not a fortress, but a frontier. And that frontier is not always well lit. But what if we chose differently? What if, instead of silencing the witness, we listened? What if we held space for anomalies, not as threats, but as invitations? What kind of world might we inherit if we allowed curiosity to lead, even when it makes us uncomfortable? We might find technologies that heal without harm, histories that honor forgotten civilizations, minds that stretch further than neurons and chemicals. A cosmos that speaks not just through telescopes, but through dreams and signals and sudden knowing. But first, we must unlearn the reflex to suppress. Because silencing a witness doesn't make their story untrue. It only makes us complicit in the loss. And each voice buried is a possibility denied, not just for knowledge, but for growth, for empathy, for becoming something more than we were. In the end, the question is not, are these stories real? The question is, what kind of world are we building if they can't even be asked? We stand at the edge of something vast, not a revelation, but a remembering. That truth has always been bigger than permission. That wonder is not a weakness. And that those who dare to speak what they've seen, even when the world refuses to see with them, are not threats. They are trailheads. And the path forward begins with a choice, to listen, to question, and above all to keep the silence from becoming the final word.